The champagne tasted like victory, each bubble a tiny explosion of success against Richard Stevens's tongue. From the top floor of the Grand Astoria, the city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights he now felt he owned. This wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. The IPO for his company, Innovate AI, had shattered every projection. At 36, he was no longer just successful. He was a titan. He adjusted the cuff of his custom Tom Ford suit, the fabric a whisper against his skin, and smiled at his fiancée, Victoria Sterling, who was draped in emeralds that matched her calculating eyes. Tonight, everything was perfect. And then he saw her, across the ballroom, moving with a quiet efficiency that seemed out of place amidst the boisterous celebration, was Amelia. His Amelia. Or she had been, once. She wore the simple black uniform of the catering staff, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. But even that couldn't dim the familiar warmth in her face. A pang, sharp and unwelcome, shot through him. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since the day he'd told her their lives were on different trajectories. His was a rocket ship. Hers, he'd implied, was a bicycle. Victoria followed his gaze. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "No one," Richard lied, his heart hammering. He excused himself, navigating the sea of backslapping investors and fawning journalists. He had to say something. It was pathetic, seeing her here. He'd make sure she was taken care of, give her a generous tip, enough to get her out of this line of work. He cornered her near a service entrance, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, a stark contrast to the symphony in the ballroom. "Mia," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, and her eyes, the color of warm honey, met his. There was no surprise, just a weary recognition. "Richard, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep the pity from his tone. "I mean, working here?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Someone has to feed the new kings of the world." He fumbled for his wallet, the black leather suddenly feeling vulgar in his hand. "Listen, let me help you. I can—" He stopped. His eyes fell from her face, down the simple black dress to the gentle, unmistakable swell of her abdomen. She was pregnant. The air left his lungs in a rush, the triumphant roar of the party fading to a dull hum. The timeline, a cruel and instant calculation, clicked into place in his brilliant mind. The baby. It could be his. She saw the realization dawn on his face. Her hand went to her belly in a protective gesture, and her expression hardened, the vulnerability replaced by a steel he'd never seen in her before. "Don't you dare, Richard," she said, her voice low and trembling with a quiet fury. "Don't you dare think for 1 second you can just write a check for this." She turned, but before she disappeared into the kitchen, she delivered the final blow. "And for the record, I'm not just a caterer. I own the company." The penthouse apartment felt less like a home and more like a showroom. Glass walls offered a panoramic view of a city that now felt hostile, its lights mocking Richard's turmoil. The IPO party had raged on, but its celebratory energy had curdled into a nauseating buzz in his ears. He'd stumbled through the rest of the night on autopilot, Victoria's sharp, questioning glances feeling like tiny daggers. "You were a complete mess after you spoke to that server," she said now, slipping out of her emerald gown. She stood before her vanity, a goddess of polished perfection, but her reflection in the mirror was cold. Who was she, Richard? "Really? My ex-wife," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. He sank onto the edge of their king-sized bed, the silk comforter offering no comfort. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand paused mid-air. "The one from before, the suburban school teacher?" Her tone was laced with a delicate disdain, as if Mia was a relic from a forgotten, primitive era of his life. She wasn't a school teacher, Victoria. She was a culinary arts instructor at the community college, he corrected, the distinction feeling absurdly important. And she owns the catering company from tonight. That gave Victoria pause. She owns it. It's a very high-end service. They're notoriously exclusive. The assessment was practical, a quick recalibration of Mia's status. Then her eyes narrowed. Why didn't you tell me she was there? And why did you look like you'd seen a ghost? She's pregnant, he blurted out, the confession raw and uncontrolled. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Victoria turned from the mirror, her face a mask of controlled fury. And the timing. He couldn't say it. He couldn't voice the cataclysmic possibility that was tearing him apart. Don't be ridiculous, Victoria snapped, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You finalized your divorce 2 years ago. This is just some ploy. She saw your name on the client list and decided to show up to make a scene, to get money out of you. It's pathetic, and frankly, I'm insulted you're even entertaining it. Meanwhile, in a modest but cozy duplex in Oak Park, a quiet suburb miles from the city's glare, Mia was curled on a worn sofa, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. Her sister, Sophia, a fiery defense attorney with eyes that missed nothing, sat on the floor, gently rubbing Mia's swollen feet. So the great Richard Stevens finally saw you, Sophia said, her voice a mixture of anger and concern. How did it feel? Like I expected, Mia murmured, tracing the rim of her mug. He looked at me like I was a stray dog he used to own. Pity, confusion. And then he saw. Her hand instinctively cradled her belly. His brain started whirring. I could almost see the numbers crunching behind his eyes. The arrogant fool, Sophia spat. Did he say anything? He tried to give me money, Mia said with a humorless laugh. A tip, to help me out. Sophia stopped rubbing her feet and looked up, her expression thunderous. He what? I swear, Mia, let me at him. I will file a paternity suit so fast his stock will drop back to 0. No, Mia said firmly. Not yet. This has to be on my terms. For 2 years, he's lived in his world, and I've built mine. He doesn't get to come crashing back in just because his conscience is pricking him. This isn't about his guilt. It's about my baby. She looked at her sister, her exhaustion evident, but her resolve unwavering. He thought I was the caterer. He was right, in a way. I catered his grand celebration. But he has no idea what the main course is going to be. Back in the sterile silence of the penthouse, Richard's phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Mark. He'd called him in a panic an hour ago. I have the divorce decree, Mark's voice said, crisp and professional. Finalized 23 months ago. Richard, what's the conception timeline we're looking at here? Richard's throat was dry. He did the math again. The last time. The bitter, final, grief-stricken night they had spent together. A foolish attempt to find closure that had only ripped the wound open wider. It had been just before the papers were officially filed. 24 months ago. Mark, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. Get a team ready. We have a problem. A 9-month, life-altering problem that he had arrogantly and completely ignored. 3 days later, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to the front porch of Mia's duplex. It didn't come from a law firm, but from a discreet, high-end private service used by the city's elite to handle sensitive matters. Sophia, who had stayed over, snatched it from the welcome mat as if it were a venomous snake. Let me guess, she said, tearing it open with barely controlled rage. A generous offer from the desk of Richard Stevens. Inside was a sheaf of documents, thick and intimidating, bound in a navy blue folder embossed with the logo of a top-tier family law practice. The lead document was a letter, not from Richard, but from his attorney, Mark Fletcher. The language was cold, precise, and brutal. It referred to Mia as the claimant and the baby as the potential issue. It proposed a one-time 7-figure payment. In exchange, Mia would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, waive all future claims, and agree to never list Richard as the father on any official document. The child's birth certificate would remain blank in the paternal field. It was a contract designed not to support a child, but to erase a liability. "He wants to buy your silence," Sophia breathed, her knuckles white as she gripped the papers. "He wants to purchase his own ghost, make sure it never haunts him or his precious stock price." "This isn't a settlement, Mia. This is an exorcism." Mia read the letter over her sister's shoulder, her stomach churning. Each word, each legalistic phrase, was a calculated blow. Confidentiality, reputational risk, amicable dissolution of any potential ties. It wasn't about a baby. It was a hostile takeover of her life. Her mind flashed back to a different time. A tiny, sun-drenched apartment above a bakery, the air thick with the smell of rising bread and cheap coffee. She and Richard, barely out of college, were sketching out their futures on a napkin. His was Innovate AI, a fledgling idea he spoke of with religious fervor. Hers was a small, farm-to-table restaurant, a place of warmth and community. They'd talked about a family, about kids running through a yard with a golden retriever. "We'll do it all, Mia," he had whispered, his eyes shining with a sincerity she hadn't seen in years. "You and me. We'll build our own world." Now he was trying to bulldoze the last piece of that world into non-existence. The memory, so sweet just a moment ago, now felt like a shard of glass in her heart. "What do you want to do?" Sophia asked gently, her lawyerly fire momentarily replaced by sisterly concern. Mia took a deep breath, the scent of the blooming hydrangeas in her small front yard grounding her. She thought of the tiny life inside her, the flutter she'd felt just that morning. This child was not a potential issue. This child was a promise. Her promise. "Get your laptop," Mia said, her voice steady. "Draft a response, a very short one." An hour later, Mark Fletcher received an email. It contained a scanned PDF of his offer letter. Scrawled across the first page in bold black marker were 3 words: "Not for sale." In his sterile corner office overlooking the financial district, Richard read the email on his phone and felt a tremor of something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. He'd approached this the way he approached every business problem, with overwhelming force and capital. But Mia wasn't a struggling startup he could acquire and dismantle. He called Mark. She rejected it, flat out. "I saw," Mark said, his tone grim. "This is a mistake on her part. She has no idea the resources we can bring to bear. We can bury her in litigation, question her motives, her character." "No," Richard interrupted, surprising himself. The thought of putting Mia through that, of dragging her name through the mud, felt vile. "Not like that. What's the next step?" "The next step, Richard, is that she's going to get a lawyer of her own," Mark replied. "And whoever she hires will tell her she's sitting on a winning lottery ticket. The daughter of the Innovate AI founder? The child support calculations alone will be astronomical. This just went from a private matter to a public spectacle." "Brace yourself." Richard hung up and stared out at the city. He had built an empire on predicting human behavior with algorithms. He could model market trends, consumer desires, and logistical chains with near-perfect accuracy. But he had completely, catastrophically, failed to predict the one person he should have known best. He had offered her a fortune, and she had responded with 2 years of silence and 3 words of defiance. The power imbalance he had taken for granted had just been shattered. The boardroom at Innovate AI was a theater of minimalist power. A single slab of polished mahogany stretched for 30 feet, surrounded by sleek leather chairs. The air was cool and still. At the head of the table sat Richard, flanked by his lawyer, Mark, and his company's COO, David Chen. David, a thoughtful man in his late 50s with graying temples, had been Richard's mentor since the beginning. He was the only one in the room who looked concerned rather than annoyed. "The optics are problematic," Mark was saying, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. A pregnant ex-wife, a new billionaire CEO. The media will frame this as a classic David and Goliath story. It could impact investor confidence right when we need stability. "So we increase the offer," another executive suggested. "Double it. Find her breaking point." Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They were talking about Mia as if she were a hostile variable in a financial equation. David Chen cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. He looked directly at Richard. "Have you considered talking to her, Richard? Not through lawyers. Just you and her." "It's too late for that," Mark interjected. "She's already lawyered up. We received a letter of representation this morning. Sofia Russo. It's her sister." "Her sister's a lawyer?" Richard asked, the information hitting him like a physical blow. Of course. Sophia, the pit bull. He remembered her from family holidays, always sharp, always watching him with a skepticism he'd dismissed as jealousy. "A damn good one, apparently," Mark grumbled. "Specializes in family law, known for being relentless. This just got personal, and a whole lot messier." David leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "All the more reason. This isn't just about the company's reputation, Richard. This is about your life. Before you deploy an army of lawyers, maybe you should try to remember you're dealing with a human being, the mother of your potential child." The word mother hung in the air, heavy and resonant. It felt alien in this room of stock options and damage control strategies. Miles away, in a sprawling, sunlit commercial kitchen in a converted warehouse, the air hummed with a different kind of energy. The scent of roasting garlic, fresh basil, and baking bread filled the space. Mia, wearing a flour-dusted apron over her maternity dress, moved with purpose, tasting a simmering tomato sauce and giving instructions to her head chef, a cheerful woman named Maria. This was the headquarters of The Humble Plate, a catering company that had become the city's go-to for organic, locally sourced, and exquisitely prepared food. Her team adored her. They were a motley crew of culinary artists, single mothers and second chances to whom Mia had given not just a job, but a purpose. Sophia found her by the large stainless steel prep table, a legal pad in her hand. "His legal team is requesting a meeting. They want to discuss an amicable path forward." "Amicable," Mia snorted, wiping her hands on a towel. "Is that what they call it when they try to buy your child's identity?" "I told them we'd meet, but on our turf," Sophia said, a predatory gleam in her eye. "I want them to see this, to see you. I don't want them thinking you're some desperate woman in a tiny apartment. This is your empire, Mia. It's time he saw it." Mia looked around her bustling kitchen. The laughter, the focused energy, the sheer life of it all. She had built this from nothing. After the divorce, after Richard had told her she lacked ambition, she'd poured every ounce of her grief and rage into the business plan they had once drafted on a napkin. He had forgotten it, but she had not. It was her revenge, a quiet, delicious success story he knew nothing about. "Do you remember why we called it The Humble Plate, Soph?" Mia asked, her voice soft. Sophia nodded. Because you said that no matter how fancy the event, everything comes back to the simple, honest ingredients. That true value isn't in the price tag, but in the care you put into it. He's forgotten that, Mia said, her gaze distant. He thinks value is a number on a stock ticker. He's surrounded by people who tell him he can buy anything. A company, a fiancé, a solution to a problem like me. She placed a hand on her belly. But some things aren't for sale. Some things you have to earn. The contrast was stark. In the silent, air-conditioned boardroom, men in expensive suits strategized about how to contain a problem. In the warm, vibrant kitchen, women in aprons created, nurtured, and prepared for a fight, not with money, but with something far more powerful. The simple, undeniable truth. The story broke, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A single, impeccably sourced item in a high society gossip column. Innovate AI's newly minted billionaire CEO, Richard Stevens, may be facing some personal headwinds following his celebratory IPO gala. Sources say a ghost from his past has reappeared, and she didn't come empty-handed. It was vague, but it was enough. The stock, which had been on a steady climb, dipped 2 points. It was a minor fluctuation, but it sent a shockwave through Richard's carefully constructed world. His phone began to ring incessantly. Investors, board members, journalists, all asking questions he couldn't answer. The pressure began to show. At a tense dinner with Victoria and her parents at their sprawling suburban mansion, the atmosphere was glacial. Her father, a silver-haired patriarch who ran an old money investment firm, looked at Richard over the rim of his wineglass with undisguised disapproval. A scandal of this nature, right after going public. It's sloppy, Richard, he said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. It suggests a lack of control. The market doesn't like surprises. Victoria, who had been unnervingly quiet, finally spoke. It's being handled, Daddy. Richard's lawyers are taking care of it. Her voice was brittle, her smile a painted-on grimace. Later that night, back in the penthouse, the facade crumbled completely. This is a nightmare, Richard, she hissed, tearing off the diamond bracelet her father had given her. My friends are texting me, asking if I know anything. I'm being humiliated. You need to make this woman go away. Pay her whatever she wants. I don't care. Just get her out of our lives. It's not that simple, Victoria, he said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. She's not just some opportunist. This is Mia. Oh, Mia, she mocked, her voice dripping with venom. The sainted first wife from your humble past. The one who apparently couldn't keep up with you. Well, it seems she's found a way to catch up now, hasn't she? A baby is the oldest trick in the book. A cold clarity washed over Richard. He looked at Victoria, truly looked at her, and saw past the beauty and the social grace to the transactional core of their relationship. She hadn't asked if he was okay. She hadn't asked about the child. Her concern was singular, how this complication affected her status, her wedding, her future as Mrs. Victoria Sterling Stevens. His world wasn't a partnership, it was an accessory she wore. I need some air, he said, grabbing his car keys. He drove without a destination, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. He found himself on a familiar route, his muscle memory taking him back across the bridge, out of the gleaming metropolis and into the tree-lined streets of the suburbs. He parked across the street from a small, blue, colonial-style house with a wraparound porch. Their first house, the one he'd sold without a second thought, calling it a starter home, an asset to be liquidated. He could see the window of what had been their bedroom. He remembered nights spent there. Mia curled against him, whispering about the future. He remembered painting the nursery a soft yellow, a hopeful, gender-neutral color for the baby they were trying for. The baby he had completely forgotten in his rabid climb to the top. The grief hit him then, a physical weight in his chest. It wasn't about the stock price or Victoria's anger. It was the crushing realization of what he had thrown away. He had told himself he was cutting away dead weight to achieve his dreams, but he was beginning to understand that he had amputated his own heart. The silence in his sterile penthouse was the sound of its absence. He had all the success he had ever wanted, and he had never felt more alone. The power he wielded felt like a gilded cage, and the man staring back at him in the rearview mirror was a stranger. Driven by a desperate impulse he couldn't explain, Richard bypassed his lawyers and drove directly to Mia's duplex the next morning. He needed to see her, to speak to her, without the filter of legal threats and corporate strategy. He found her in the front yard, kneeling in a patch of dirt, carefully planting pansies. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her pregnancy more pronounced in the soft morning light. She looked up as his car door shut, her expression immediately wary. She rose slowly, brushing the soil from her hands. "What are you doing here, Richard?" Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I needed to talk to you," he stammered, feeling like a clumsy intruder in her peaceful world. "Without the lawyers, there's nothing to say that our lawyers can't," she replied, not inviting him in. She stood her ground on the small lawn, a silent guardian of her home. "Isn't there?" he pushed, his desperation making him reckless. "Mia, why didn't you tell me? Why hide this for so long, only to show up at my gala? Was this the plan all along? To wait until I was at my most successful, my most public, and then strike?" The accusation was ugly, born of Victoria's poisonous whispers and his own panicked ego. Mia's face, which had been so carefully neutral, hardened into a mask of pure, undiluted pain. A humorless, heartbreaking laugh escaped her lips. "You think this was a plan?" she said, her voice trembling. "You think I have spent the last 2 years of my life plotting to strike you? My God, you really have no idea." She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw the deep, settled exhaustion in her eyes. This wasn't anger. It was a grief so profound it had become a part of her. "Let me tell you about the plan, Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a raw whisper. "The plan was to tell you the good news over a special dinner. I had it all set up. I'd just come from the doctor. I had the positive test in my purse, the first one after a year of trying and heartbreak." Richard's blood ran cold. He searched his memory, a frantic scramble through the archives of his ambition. "The day you left me," she continued, her voice breaking, "was the day after I found out I was pregnant. I came home, ready to tell you that our dream was finally coming true. But you were already on the phone, pacing in the living room. You were celebrating. Your first round of major seed funding had just come through." The memory slammed into him. The call, the euphoria, the feeling that he was finally escaping his small life. "I waited for you to get off the phone." Mia's voice was barely audible now, thick with unshed tears. "And when you finally did, you wouldn't even look at me. You just said, 'Mia, we need to talk.' You told me you were going to the top, and you needed to travel light. You said you had to cut away the dead weight to succeed. Cut away the dead weight." His own words, so callous and cruel, came back to condemn him. "I tried to tell you, Richard," she whispered, a single tear finally tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. "My hand was on my purse, on the test result. But you were already gone. You were looking right through me, at a future that I wasn't in. You said I didn't have your ambition, that I was content with a small life. You made me feel like I was an anchor holding you down. So I let you go, and I let you believe you were cutting away dead weight. The world tilted on its axis. He had built his entire narrative of their breakup on a lie he'd told himself, that he had outgrown her. The truth was infinitely more horrific. He hadn't just left his wife, he had abandoned her at the most vulnerable, most joyful moment of her life, and he had been so consumed by his own ambition he hadn't even noticed. He stumbled back, leaning against his car for support, the polished metal cold against his back. The air was thick with the scent of pansies and freshly turned earth, but all he could smell was the smoke of his incinerated life. I was the dead weight, Richard, she said, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Both of us. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom felt like a universe away from Mia's sun-drenched garden. The preliminary hearing wasn't about custody or visitation yet. It was a formal petition to establish paternity and temporary support. It should have been a straightforward affair, but Richard's legal team, led by Mark Fletcher, had decided to play hardball, filing a motion to question Mia's timeline and motives. Richard sat beside Mark at the plaintiff's table, feeling like a fraud in his perfectly tailored suit. Across the aisle, Mia sat with Sophia, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on the judge. She looked serene, but Richard could see the subtle tension in her hands, clasped protectively over her belly. Mark's opening statement was a masterclass in veiled insinuation. He painted a picture of a woman who had remained silent for nearly 2 years, only to surface at a moment of peak publicity. He used phrases like unfortunate timing and financial opportunism, carefully avoiding direct accusations, but planting seeds of doubt. My client has always been prepared to meet his responsibilities, Mark concluded, gesturing toward Richard. But those responsibilities must first be unequivocally established, free from any hint of coercion or ulterior motives. Then it was Sophia's turn. She rose, not with fire and brimstone, but with a quiet, lethal calm. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Stevens's counsel speaks of unfortunate timing. Let's talk about timing. Let's talk about the timing of my sister finding out she was carrying his child the very day before Mr. Stevens informed her she was dead weight in his quest for success. Let's talk about the 2 years she has spent building a life and a successful business on her own, asking for nothing, while Mr. Stevens built an empire, forgetting she ever existed." She walked slowly towards the witness stand, where Mia would soon have to testify. "This is not about coercion, Your Honor. This is about consequence. For 2 years, my sister shielded Mr. Stevens from the consequences of his actions, not out of malice, but to protect herself and her child from the very man who saw them as a liability. The only reason we are here today is because Mr. Stevens, upon discovering his impending fatherhood, did not reach out with compassion. He reached out with a contract designed to legally erase his own child." Sophia placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. "My client is not here for a lottery ticket. She is here for a birth certificate. She is here to ensure that her child is not a dirty little secret, a footnote in a billionaire's biography. She's here for her child's identity, an identity Mr. Stevens tried to purchase and bury." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, looked over her spectacles at Richard. Her gaze was penetrating, and for the first time since the IPO, Richard felt truly powerless. He was stripped of his wealth, his status, his army of lawyers. He was just a man, being judged on the merit of his character, and he was found wanting. He saw the faces of his board members who had come to observe, their expressions turning from confident to concerned. He saw David Chen in the back row, shaking his head with profound disappointment. The proceedings wore on, a brutal dissection of his and Mia's final days together. Mark's associate cross-examined Mia, trying to poke holes in her story, questioning her finances, her decision not to contact Richard sooner. Through it all, Mia remained unshaken, her answers simple, honest, and devastating. "Why didn't you tell him?" the lawyer pressed. Mia looked not at the lawyer, but directly at Richard. Her voice, though soft, filled the courtroom. "Because he had already told me who I was to him," she said. "I was a liability. You don't hand your heart to the man who just told you it's weighing him down. You pick it up, and you learn to carry it yourself." The words struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. He finally understood. This wasn't a battle for money. It was a reckoning for his soul. And he was losing. The courtroom took a brief recess. The air in the hallway was thick with tension. Mark was huddled with his junior associates, furiously scribbling notes and planning their next line of attack. Victoria, who had insisted on being there to present a united front, was tapping her stilettos impatiently on the marble floor, her face a mask of cold fury. "This is a disaster," she seethed in a low voice, meant only for Richard. "That sister of hers is running circles around your high-priced lawyer. You look weak, Richard. Guilty." Richard barely heard her. He was watching Mia at the other end of the hall. She was standing by a window, Sophia's arm wrapped around her shoulders. She looked tired, drained by the ordeal, but she also looked unbreakable. He saw the strength he had once mistaken for a lack of ambition. It wasn't that she didn't want to soar, it was that her roots went deep, into things that mattered: loyalty, integrity, love. He had been the one who was shallow, rootless. David Chen approached him, his expression grim. "Is this really how you want to do this, son?" he asked quietly, pulling Richard aside. "Tearing her down in public to save a few stock points? This isn't business. There's a child involved. Your child. Mark says it's the only way to protect the company's interests," Richard mumbled, the excuse sounding feeble even to himself. "To hell with the company's interests for a minute," David said, his voice firm. "What about your interests as a man, as a father? You have a choice right now. You can continue down this path and win a legal battle but lose everything that matters. Or you can stop. Just stop." David's words, coupled with the image of Mia by the window, acted like a key, turning in a lock Richard hadn't known was rusted shut. He looked at Victoria, with her perfectly calculated beauty and her all-consuming concern for appearances. He looked at Mark, with his talk of optics and damage control, and he realized they were all part of the gilded cage he had built for himself. When the judge reconvened the session, Mark stood up, ready to call his next witness, a private investigator hired to dig into Mia's life. "Mr. Fletcher," the judge said, "please proceed." As Mark opened his mouth to speak, Richard stood up. "Your Honor." Mark shot him a panicked look. "Richard, sit down." Richard ignored him. He walked to the center of the courtroom, standing alone between the two tables. He felt the weight of every eye on him. His heart hammered, not with fear, but with a terrifying, liberating clarity. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "I would like to dismiss my counsel's motion." A gasp rippled through the room. Mark looked apoplectic. Sophia's eyes widened in surprise. Richard turned to face Mia. The entire courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, all of it faded away. There was only her. "I concede," he said, the words raw and honest. "I am the father of this child. Everything Mia and her sister have said is true. I was blind, and I was cruel, and I was a coward." He took a breath, the confession releasing a pressure he hadn't known he was carrying. "I am not here to fight you, Mia. I'm here to apologize. Not for the cameras or the stock price, but for me. To you. What I did is unforgivable. I threw away the best thing in my life because I was too arrogant to see what it was worth. He looked at the judge. I will agree to any and all terms for paternity and support. I withdraw all of our previous objections. This fight is over. He turned and walked back to his table, picked up his briefcase, and walked past a stunned Mark and a horrified Victoria. He didn't look back. As he pushed open the heavy courtroom doors and stepped back into the hallway, he felt the crushing weight of his empire lift from his shoulders. He had just surrendered, publicly and completely. And for the first time in years, he felt free. The fallout from Richard's courtroom confession was immediate and seismic. The story was no longer a gossip column whisper. It was a headline. Billionaire CEO admits paternity, apologizes to ex-wife in shocking courtroom surrender. Innovate AI's stock took a sharp 15% dive. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Victoria, in a curt and frigid phone call, officially ended their engagement. Richard accepted it all. He attended the board meeting, not with excuses, but with a quiet resignation. He offered to step down as CEO. It was David Chen who spoke up for him. What Richard did in that courtroom was not an act of corporate malfeasance, he argued. It was an act of personal integrity. It was late, yes, but it was real. Let him fix this. Let him show the market that our company is led not by a machine, but by a man who is willing to own his mistakes. The board, swayed by David's logic and a grudging respect for Richard's public self-immolation, agreed. He would remain as CEO, but on a tight leash. Richard's first act was not to salvage the stock price, but to do what he should have done from the beginning. He called Sophia Russo's office and set up a meeting, not with his lawyers, but with just himself. He sat across from Sophia and a wary Mia in a small, unassuming conference room. There were no offers, no contracts. I want to do more than just write a check for child support, he said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate confidence. I want to earn the right to be a father. I don't know what that looks like, or if it's even possible, but I want to try. He outlined a proposal. He was liquidating a significant portion of his personal stock, enough to create an irrevocable trust for the child that would make them independently wealthy for life. It was not hush money. It was a legacy, but there was more. What you said about me, Mia, that I saw you as lacking ambition. It was the cruelest, most untrue thing I ever said. You built an incredible business from scratch while I was distracted. You're the kind of entrepreneur my company claims to champion. He told them his plan. He was using another large portion of his wealth to establish a foundation, the Stevens Foundation for Culinary Entrepreneurship. Its mission would be to provide seed funding, mentorship, and business support, specifically for women, like Mia, who wanted to start their own food-based businesses. He asked if she would consider serving on the advisory board, not as a favor, but because no one was more qualified. Mia was silent for a long time, studying his face, searching for the man she used to know. Sophia watched, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Why? Mia finally asked. Why all this? Because building things is all I know how to do, Richard answered honestly. For the last few years, I've been building the wrong things, empty things. I'd like to try building something that lasts, something that might, one day, make my daughter proud. A few months later, Grace Amelia Stevens was born. She had Richard's dark hair and Mia's warm, honey-colored eyes. Richard was at the hospital, not in the delivery room. He hadn't earned that right, but in the waiting area. Sophia brought him the news. His first time holding his daughter was terrifying and sacred. He looked down at the tiny, perfect creature in his arms and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming it brought him to his knees. He understood, in that moment, that this tiny baby was his redemption. She was not a complication or a liability. She was a foundation stone for a new life, one built not on stock prices and success, but on something real and true. He had a lot of work to do, a lifetime of trust to earn, but for the first time, he knew he was building something that mattered. 2 years flew by in a blur of diapers, board meetings, and tentative steps toward a new kind of family. Richard's life was unrecognizable from the one he'd led in the penthouse. He had moved into a modest townhouse in Oak Park, just a few blocks from Mir. He was still the CEO of Innovate AI, but his leadership style had changed. He was more empathetic, more grounded, more human. The company, after the initial shock, had rebounded stronger than ever, its story now one of redemption and corporate responsibility. The Stevens Foundation was a resounding success, having already helped launch a dozen women-led businesses across the state. Mia, as a guiding voice on its board, had found a new passion in mentoring others. Her own company, The Humble Plate, had expanded, and she was now a celebrated figure in the city's culinary scene. They weren't a couple in the traditional sense. The romantic trust had been too profoundly broken for that. But they were partners. They were co-parents to a bright, giggling toddler named Grace, who was the undisputed center of their universe. Their weekly routine involved shared dinners, park outings, and parent-teacher conferences. It was a life built not on a shared past, but on a shared commitment to a future. Today was the Foundation's annual fundraising gala, a large outdoor event in a beautiful botanical garden. The caterer, of course, was The Humble Plate. Richard stood near a gently bubbling fountain, holding Grace's small hand as she pointed excitedly at the colorful koi fish. He wore a simple navy suit, no longer the armor of a corporate titan, but the comfortable attire of a father. He watched Mia as she directed her staff, moving with the same quiet confidence he'd seen at his IPO gala. But now, he didn't see a server or a problem. He saw a queen in her element, a creator, the brilliant and resilient mother of his child. She caught his eye from across the lawn and gave him a warm, genuine smile. It was a smile that held no bitterness, only a shared history and a peaceful present. He smiled back, his heart full. Grace tugged on his hand. "Dada, cookie!" He laughed, scooping her up into his arms. "Let's go ask Mama if we can have one." As he walked toward Mia, he knew this was his victory. Not the ringing of the stock exchange bell, but this. The feeling of his daughter's arms around his neck, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the sight of the woman he had almost lost, thriving in a world she had built herself. The power imbalance was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding respect. They were two separate, successful people, bound together by the greatest project of their lives. It wasn't the future he had once ruthlessly planned, but it was so much better. This story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in our connections, our integrity, and our courage to make amends. It's about the strength it takes to rebuild a life from ashes, and the grace it takes to forgive. If Mia's journey from betrayal to empowerment resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of second chances, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and explore the deep complexities of real life. Thank you for watching. Robert Kemp had everything a man could dream of: a billion-dollar empire, a penthouse that scraped the New York skyline, and a wife whose beauty was the envy of his circle. But from his sterile glass office, 30 floors above the city, he watched the storm clouds gather, an ominous mirror to the tempest brewing in his own home. He had become a ghost in his marriage, haunted by ambition and a secret that lived on his phone under a different name. He believed he had all the time in the world to fix it, to choose his wife, Rachel, and their unborn child. But that night, as the rain lashed against the windows and he saw her frail figure collapse on the slick pavement below, he realized time had just run out. He thought the tragedy was the storm, the collapse, the betrayal. He was wrong. The real storm was what she did next. The penthouse felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit on wealth. It was all clean lines, Italian marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan. Robert Kemp stood before one of these windows, not admiring the view, but watching his own reflection superimposed over the sprawling city lights. He saw the sharp cut of his Tom Ford suit, the glint of his Patek Philippe watch, and the weary set of his jaw. He was the king of this kingdom, but the crown felt heavier than it ever had. Behind him, Rachel moved through the cavernous living room like a whisper. She used to fill this space with laughter and the scent of the oil paints she loved. Now, her presence was almost apologetic. He heard the soft clink of a ceramic mug on the granite countertop. "Robert, I made some chamomile tea," she said, her voice soft, trying to find a crack in the wall of his focus. "Thanks, Lena," he murmured, his eyes still locked on the phone in his hand. The numbers on the screen represented the final push for the Aperture Tech acquisition, a deal that would cement his legacy, a deal worth more than most small countries. It was all he could think about. She drifted closer, her hand resting tentatively on his arm. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, a reaction born of a guilt so profound it had become a part of his physical wiring. He'd been working late for months. Working was the official term. Isabel Moreau, the brilliant and ruthless head of his European division, was the unofficial one. Their relationship was a transaction of ambition and convenience, a sterile affair that took place in 5-star hotels and private jets, a world away from this home he was slowly poisoning. "You seem so far away," Rachel said, her thumb stroking the sleeve of his suit. "Is everything okay with the deal?" "It's the final stretch. High stakes. You know how it is," he said, the excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. He finally turned to her, really looking at her for the first time all evening. Her normally vibrant face was pale, and there were faint, lavender shadows under her kind, brown eyes. She was wearing one of his old, oversized cashmere sweaters, and it only emphasized her fragility. He felt a pang of something, not just guilt, but a deep, aching loss for the man he used to be with her. The man who would have dropped everything to listen. "I have something to tell you," she said, a nervous energy fluttering in her voice. "Something that might help. Ground us again." He forced a smile, pocketing his phone. "I'm all ears." She took a deep breath and led him to the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she held his. "We've been talking about it for so long, about when the right time would be. With your work being so crazy, I know it's never seemed perfect. But maybe this is what makes it perfect." She was rambling, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. "What now?" She placed his hand on her flat stomach. The cashmere was soft beneath his palm. "Robert," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." The words hit him like a physical blow. A baby, a child, a life that would bind him to this home, to this woman, forever. A decade ago, this would have been his ultimate dream. He and Rachel, building a family in the city they loved. But now it felt like a complication, another variable in an equation he could no longer control. His mind wasn't on a nursery, it was on hostile takeovers, and Isabel's sharp, strategic mind that mirrored his own. He looked at Rachel's hopeful face, at the pure, unadulterated joy in her eyes, and the lie was already forming on his lips. "Lena, that's amazing news." He pulled her into a hug, the gesture stiff and unnatural. He was holding his wife, the mother of his child, but his mind was across the ocean in a different city, with a different woman. As he held her, he felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. A text message. He knew exactly who it was from. And in that moment, holding his pregnant wife, Robert Kemp knew he was a fraud of the highest order. The days that followed Rachel's announcement were a masterclass in deception. Robert played the part of the expectant father with chilling precision. He accompanied her to the first doctor's appointment, watching the grainy, pulsing image on the ultrasound screen with feigned awe. He held her hand, squeezed it at the right moments, and said all the right things. "A heartbeat," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a performance that deserved an award. "Our baby's heartbeat." But his heart wasn't in that sterile, hopeful room. It was in encrypted emails and hushed late-night calls. The Aperture Tech deal was entering its most volatile phase. Isabel was his general on the front lines in London, and their communication was constant, a blend of corporate strategy and the clipped, intimate shorthand of their affair. "The board is wavering, Robert. We need a show of force." Isabel's voice would crackle through his high-tech earpiece as he stared out at the city, Rachel sleeping peacefully in their bed, just a room away. "I'll be there Monday," he'd promised, the lie slipping out easily. He'd tell Rachel it was a last-minute emergency board meeting, a fire he had to put out in person. She was always so understanding. Too understanding. Her trust was a knife he twisted in his own gut with every lie he told. Rachel, meanwhile, tried to build a nest in their cold, modern penthouse. She brought home books on parenting, fabric swatches for a nursery, and organic prenatal vitamins that sat accusingly on the kitchen counter. She was trying to build a bridge back to him, brick by hopeful brick, and he was letting her do it, knowing a tidal wave was coming. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, began on a Thursday night. A fierce nor'easter was barreling toward the city, and the sky had been a bruised purple all day. Robert was on a conference call in his home office, the door shut but not quite latched. It was a tense negotiation with Aperture's primary shareholders, and Isabel was on the line from London, her voice sharp and commanding. "They're trying to leverage the media against us, Robert. We need to kill that narrative before it gets legs," Isabel said, her French accent sharpening with urgency. "I'll have my PR team draft a statement immediately," Robert replied, pacing the length of the office. "No, it needs to come from you. A personal touch," she insisted. "You'll be here Monday. We can strategize over dinner Sunday night. Just us." There was an intimacy in her tone that was more than professional. A shared history of battles, won in the boardroom and celebrated in the bedroom. "I miss you," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Meant only for him. He didn't respond to that part, acutely aware of the paper-thin walls of his life. But it was too late. Rachel had been walking past the office, a plate of sliced apples in her hand, a peace offering for his stressful day. She'd heard Isabel's voice, a voice she recognized from company galas and shareholder reports. But it was the tone that made her freeze, the possessiveness, the familiarity. "I miss you." The three simple words landed like stones, shattering the fragile glass of her denial. She pushed the door open slightly. Robert stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the window where lightning was beginning to fork across the sky. He was completely absorbed, a different man from the one who had smiled at the ultrasound. This was the real Robert, the one she had been losing for months. He ended the call and turned, finally noticing her in the doorway. The plate of apples slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. "Lena?" he asked, his face a mask of concern, but his eyes, for a split second, flashed with the panic of being caught. "Who is Isabel Moreau to you, Robert?" she asked, her voice quiet and dangerously steady. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, devastating question. "She's my colleague, head of the European division. You know that," he said, taking a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Don't," she warned, holding up a hand. The first tear escaped, tracing a path down her pale cheek. "Don't lie to me. I heard her. The way she spoke to you, the air crackled with a tension that rivaled the storm outside. The first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the windows, like accusations being thrown from the heavens. He could see the dawning, horrific realization in her eyes. The later nights, the sudden trips, the emotional distance, all the scattered pieces were clicking into place for her, forming a picture of betrayal so ugly it stole her breath. "Rachel, it's not what you think," he began, the most pathetic and predictable of all clichés. "Isn't it?" she whispered, her gaze dropping to her stomach, her hand instinctively moving to shield the tiny, innocent life within. "Or is it exactly what I think?" The shattered plate on the floor was a prelude. The real explosion came next. Rachel's quiet devastation erupted into a storm of grief and rage that had been brewing for months. "All this time," she choked out, her voice raw. "All those late nights you were closing a deal. All those trips to put out fires. Was she the fire, Robert? Was our marriage the thing you were trying to escape?" Robert felt the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Every lie, every evasion was being laid bare under the harsh light of her pain. "Rachel, it's complicated. The business—" "Don't you dare hide behind your business!" she shrieked, the sound foreign and terrifying coming from her. "This isn't about business. This is about us. This is about you looking me in the eye at our first ultrasound and telling me you loved me while you were sleeping with another woman." The rain was a torrential downpour now, hammering against the windows in furious, percussive blasts. The wind howled, a symphony for their marital collapse. "It wasn't like that," he insisted, his voice rising. It was a mistake. A symptom of the pressure I've been under." "A mistake?" she repeated, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. A mistake is not setting the alarm. This is a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to betray our child before it's even born." Her words were daggers, each one finding its mark. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to somehow absorb her pain, but he knew he was the source of it. He was the poison. His phone buzzed on the desk. A text. Then another. It was Isabel. "The shareholders are calling an emergency virtual meeting. Midnight London time. You need to be on this call, Robert. This is it." Midnight in London was 7 p.m. in New York. Right now. He glanced at his phone, a flicker of instinct, and Rachel saw it. Her eyes, red-rimmed and filled with tears, narrowed with a new, colder fury. "Of course," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a chilling resignation. "Even now. She's more important. The deal is more important." "Lena, that's not true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was torn. The call was the culmination of 2 years of work, his legacy, his empire. But his wife, his pregnant wife, was falling apart in front of him. "I need some air," she said numbly, turning and walking toward the door, her movements robotic. "Air! Rachel, look outside! There's a hurricane out there!" he yelled, panicked. "Where are you going?" "Away from you," she said, her voice flat. She pulled on a thin raincoat, her hands shaking too much to properly button it. I can't breathe in here anymore. I can't breathe the same air as you." She pulled the heavy door open and stepped out into the hallway. He started to go after her, but his phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was his COO. "Robert, you need to get on the line now. They're threatening to walk." He was frozen in a moment of impossible choice. His entire professional life on one line, his entire personal life walking out the door. In a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, driven by the adrenaline of the deal, he chose the call. "I'll just stabilize this. Then I'll go after her," he told himself. "She'll just go down to the lobby and cool off." He answered the call, his voice a strained, false calm. "I'm here. Let's handle this." He walked back to the window of his office as he talked, his words about market caps and shareholder value a meaningless drone in his ears. He scanned the street below, searching for her. And then he saw her. Rachel hadn't gone to the lobby. She had walked out onto the street, into the full fury of the storm. The wind whipped her raincoat around her, and the rain plastered her hair to her face. She looked small and lost, a solitary figure in the chaos of the weather. She took a few unsteady steps, then swayed. From 30 floors up, it was like watching a silent movie. He saw her hand go to her stomach. He saw her knees buckle. He saw her collapse onto the wet, glistening pavement. A fallen leaf in a raging river. "No," he breathed into the phone. The voices of the shareholders faded into a dull roar. The billion-dollar deal vanished. The only thing in the world was the image of his wife, his pregnant wife, lying motionless in the middle of a storm he had created. He dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the voices still chattering from the speaker. He didn't hear them. He was already running, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He had made his choice. And it was the wrong one. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. Robert jabbed the lobby button repeatedly, his mind a maelstrom of panic and regret. The calm, calculating CEO was gone, replaced by a terrified husband. He burst out of the building's grand entrance, the doorman shouting after him, and ran into the deluge. The rain was cold and stinging, soaking his suit in seconds. He saw her immediately, a small heap on the dark, rain-slicked asphalt. A taxi swerved violently to avoid her. "Rachel!" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the wind. He reached her side, dropping to his knees on the pavement. Her face was terrifyingly pale, her eyes closed. He felt for a pulse in her neck, his fingers clumsy and shaking. It was there, faint, but there. "Somebody help!" he roared at the indifferent city. "Call 911. He gently cradled her head, trying to shield her from the worst of the rain with his own body. "Lena, I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words a useless, pathetic mantra. "Please wake up. Please be okay." The wail of a siren cut through the storm's howl. Paramedics were there within minutes, their movements efficient and urgent. They loaded Rachel onto a stretcher, her face stark white against the red canvas. Robert tried to climb into the ambulance with her, but a paramedic held him back. "Sir, we need room to work. Follow us to Lenox Hill Hospital." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and it sped away, its lights painting streaks of red and white on the wet streets. Robert was left standing alone in the storm, dripping and broken. For the first time, he felt the true weight of his actions. This wasn't a negotiation he could win or a problem he could throw money at. This was a consequence, real and terrifying. At the hospital, the minutes bled into hours. He sat in a sterile, beige waiting room, the smell of antiseptic burning his nostrils. He had called her emergency contact, her best friend Clara, who arrived looking like a storm cloud herself, her eyes shooting daggers of pure hatred at him. "What did you do to her?" Clara demanded, her voice low and venomous. Robert started, but no words came. What could he say? I broke her heart and she collapsed from the stress. I prioritized a business deal over my pregnant wife. Finally, a doctor appeared. "Mr. Vance?" Robert shot to his feet. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay?" "Your wife is stable," the doctor said, his expression grim. "She suffered from a vasovagal syncope episode, a sudden drop in heart rate and blood pressure, likely brought on by extreme emotional distress. It caused her to faint. We're keeping her overnight for observation. The baby's heartbeat is stable for now, but this was a significant shock to her system. She needs to avoid all forms of stress." The doctor's gaze was pointed, leaving no doubt who he considered the primary source of that stress. The relief that washed over Robert was so immense his legs nearly gave out. But it was short-lived, replaced by a new wave of dread. Rachel was awake. She was asking to see Clara, not him. He waited another hour before Clara emerged, her face softened slightly with pity. "She'll see you now. Be gentle, Robert. For God's sake, just be gentle." He walked into the private room on trembling legs. Rachel was sitting up in bed, looking impossibly small against the white pillows. An IV was taped to her hand. She looked exhausted, fragile, but as he met her gaze, he saw something new in her eyes. The hurt was still there, but it was overshadowed by a calm, unbreakable resolve. The fire of her anger had burned out, leaving behind something harder, like tempered steel. "Lena, he started, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry. I can't tell you how sorry I am." She held up a hand, stopping him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, devoid of the emotion from before. It was that very lack of emotion that terrified him. "I've had a lot of time to think, lying here," she said, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just past his shoulder. "About us. About this baby." "We can fix this," he pleaded, taking a step closer. "I'll cancel the trip. I'll sell the company. I don't care. I'll do anything." "No, you won't," she said simply. "Because this isn't about one deal or one trip, Robert. It's about who you are. Your ambition is a hunger that will never be full. I thought I could be enough. I thought this baby would be enough. But we'll always just be an inconvenient distraction from your real love." "That's not true." She finally looked at him, and the coldness in her eyes chilled him to the bone. This was her stunning move. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a demand, it was a declaration. "It's over, Robert," she said. The words were delivered without malice, as a simple statement of fact. "I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to scream anymore. I'm just done. I'm filing for divorce." He stared at her, speechless. He had expected tears, ultimatums, a chance to bargain. He had not expected this quiet, final severance. "I will not raise my child in a house filled with lies and ghosts," she continued, her hand resting on her stomach. "This baby deserves a mother who isn't waiting by the window for a husband who will never truly come home. So you can have your empire. You can have your deal. You can have Isabel. I am taking my child, and I am building a life, a real one, somewhere else." She had taken the biggest crisis of their lives, the moment of her greatest vulnerability, and found in it a strength he had never seen. She wasn't a victim collapsing in the storm. She was a survivor walking out of the wreckage, and she was leaving him behind. Robert returned to the penthouse the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city scrubbed clean and glistening under a pale, watery sun. But inside his home, the storm raged on. The silence was the first thing that hit him. It was a physical presence, vast and suffocating. The air was still, heavy with the echoes of last night's fight. The shattered apple plate had been cleaned up by the overnight staff, but the ghost of it remained. Rachel was gone. He walked through the rooms, a trespasser in his own life. Half the clothes in her closet were missing. Her favorite books were gone from the nightstand. The small wooden easel she kept in the corner of the living room, which she hadn't used in years but refused to part with, was gone. The only thing she'd left behind was a single, framed photo on his bedside table, a picture of them from their honeymoon in Italy, young and ridiculously happy, their faces lit by the Tuscan sun. It was a cruel reminder of the man he'd once been. His phone, which he'd retrieved from his office, buzzed with notifications, emails of congratulations, texts from his board. The Aperture Tech deal had closed in the early hours of the morning. His gambit had paid off. He was now, by all metrics, more powerful and successful than ever. The deal of a lifetime was done. He stared at the email from his COO, the subject line in all caps. "We did it!" He felt nothing. The triumphant thrill he had chased for 2 years was completely absent. The victory was hollow, a feast of ashes. He had won the world and lost his soul. The days turned into a week, then 2. Robert moved through his life like an automaton. He went to meetings, made decisions, and managed his empire with the same ruthless efficiency as always. But it was a performance. Inside, he was spiraling. He'd try to call Rachel, but the calls went straight to voicemail. His texts, increasingly desperate pleas for a conversation, remained unanswered, a string of stark blue bubbles with no reply. She had blocked him completely. He sent flowers to Clara's apartment, where he assumed Rachel was staying. They were returned the next day with a curt note. "She doesn't want them." He had his lawyer reach out to her, and the response came back through her own attorney, a woman with a reputation for being a shark. The message was cold and clear. All communication would be through legal channels. The divorce papers were being drawn up. The penthouse became his prison. Every object mocked him. He saw Rachel in the curve of the sofa where she used to read, in the kitchen where she'd tried to teach him how to cook, in the empty space beside him in their sprawling bed. He stopped sleeping, haunted by the image of her collapsing in the rain. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the sound of the ambulance siren echoing in the silent room. One night, drowning in whiskey and self-loathing, he found a box in the back of a storage closet. It was filled with Rachel's old sketchbooks. He sat on the floor and flipped through them. There were charcoal sketches of the city, watercolors of flowers, and countless portraits of him. Early in their relationship, she had drawn him constantly. Robert laughing, Robert sleeping, Robert staring thoughtfully into the distance. She had seen him, really seen him, with an artist's eye and a lover's heart. The last drawing in the final book was from a year ago. It was a sketch of his back as he sat at his desk, his face illuminated only by the glow of his laptop. The drawing was stark, lonely, and unfinished. She had stopped seeing his face and only saw his back. She had seen him turning away long before he had. The realization was a gut punch. This wasn't a sudden implosion. It was a slow, creeping decay he had been too blind and too arrogant to notice. His ambition hadn't just been a distraction. It had been an eraser, slowly wiping away the color and life from their marriage until only a faint, sad outline was left. He finally called Isabel. She answered, her voice bright and victorious. "Robert, I was wondering when you'd call to celebrate. I've booked our usual spot at Le Bernardin for tonight." He stood up, the sketchbook still in his hand, and walked to the window overlooking the city he had conquered. "It's over, Isabel," he said, his voice flat and dead. There was a pause. "The deal is done, Robert. What's over?" "Us," he clarified. "This, whatever it was. It's over." It was a mistake. He could hear her sharp intake of breath, the surprise and indignation, but he didn't care. He ended the call before she could reply, tossing the phone onto the sofa. Ending it with Isabel wasn't a solution. It was just one small, pathetic step on a long, dark road of atonement. He had to fix himself before he could even begin to ask for a chance to be a father to his child. The silence of the penthouse pressed in, and for the first time, Robert Kemp began to listen. While Robert was rattling around in his gilded cage, Rachel was starting over in a small, second-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that belonged to her friend, Clara. The place was cluttered with books, half-finished canvases, and the comforting scent of coffee and turpentine. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the penthouse, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel could breathe. The first week was a blur of exhaustion and grief. She slept, cried, and ate the simple, nourishing meals Clara put in front of her. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of the woman she used to be. The trauma of the collapse and the subsequent hospital stay had left her physically weak, and the doctor's warning to avoid stress felt like a cruel joke. Her entire life was stress, but as her physical strength slowly returned, something else began to stir within her. A flicker of the old Rachel, the artist, the woman who existed before she became Mrs. Robert Kemp. One afternoon, Clara came home from her job as a gallery curator to find Rachel staring at a blank canvas that had been leaning against the wall. "I haven't painted in 3 years," Rachel said softly, her hand hovering over the pristine white surface. "Robert, he said the fumes weren't good for the penthouse's air filtration system." Clara snorted. "Robert wouldn't know a real thing if it hit him in his custom-tailored suit. The only thing he filters is his conscience." She put a comforting hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Maybe it's time to make a mess." That evening, Rachel picked up a piece of charcoal. Her hand felt clumsy at first, the muscle memory buried under years of disuse. But then, she began to draw. She didn't think. She just let the emotions flow out of her fingertips and onto the canvas. She drew the storm, not the literal one, but the emotional tempest that had been her life. Dark, swirling lines, flashes of jagged white, and at the center, a small, protected space, a calm eye in the hurricane. It was raw, chaotic, and deeply honest. For the next few months, painting became her therapy and her salvation. She poured all her pain, her anger, and her burgeoning hope into her work. The canvases piled up in the small apartment, abstract explorations of betrayal, portraits of strength emerging from sorrow, and vibrant, hopeful landscapes that represented the future she was determined to build for her child. She was no longer just the millionaire's discarded wife. She was an artist, reclaiming her voice, brushstroke by brushstroke. Her belly grew, a constant, gentle reminder of the new life she was protecting. She talked to the baby constantly, promising it a world filled with color, love, and honesty. This child would not be raised in the shadow of a glass tower, defined by its father's wealth. This child would be raised in the light. Her lawyer, a formidable woman named Margaret, handled the divorce proceedings with brutal efficiency. Robert's first offer was, predictably, a monetary one. A settlement so large it was obscene, a trust fund for the baby that would ensure it never wanted for anything. Rachel's response, delivered through Margaret, was swift and unequivocal. "I don't want his money. I want his accountability." She wasn't going to be bought off. She would accept child support, as was the baby's right, But she refused any personal alimony. She would make her own way. Her demands were not financial. They were personal. She wanted a clear, legally binding co-parenting plan. She wanted Robert to attend parenting classes. She wanted him to undergo therapy to deal with his work addiction and narcissism. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was trying to ensure that their child would have a father who was present, not just a benefactor who was absent. Margaret was stunned. In 20 years of divorce law, I've never had a client turn down a settlement like that, she told Rachel over the phone. You're either crazy or the strongest woman I've ever met. I'm a mother, Rachel replied simply. My child's well-being is not for sale. Her strength wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a quiet, deep-rooted power that had grown in the ruins of her old life. She was building a new foundation, not with marble and steel, but with paint, courage, and a fierce, protective love for the baby growing inside her. She was terrified, yes, but for the first time in years, she felt truly, authentically alive. She was no longer a reflection of Robert's success. She was the creator of her own. The meeting took place in a neutral, sterile conference room at a mediation firm in Midtown. It was the first time Robert and Rachel had been in the same room in 4 months. The air was thick with unspoken words and the formal presence of their lawyers. Robert saw her the moment she walked in. Pregnancy suited her. It had softened the sharp edges of her grief, replacing them with a quiet, powerful glow. She carried herself with a newfound confidence that was both beautiful and intimidating. She met his gaze for a brief second, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention to her lawyer, Margaret. The dismissal was more painful than any angry tirade. Robert had spent the last 4 months in his own personal hell. He had done what she'd asked. He'd found a therapist, a no-nonsense psychiatrist who specialized in high-powered executives with personality disorders. The sessions were brutal, forcing Robert to confront the empty, validation-seeking void that drove him. He had also enrolled in a parenting class in a community center downtown, sitting awkwardly in a circle of plastic chairs with a dozen other expectant couples, learning how to swaddle a doll and change a diaper. He was the only one there alone. He was changing, but he knew it was just a start. He wasn't doing it to win her back. He knew that bridge had been burned. He was doing it for the child. He was doing it so he could one day look his son or daughter in the eye and not see a reflection of his own failures. Mr. Vance, Margaret began, her voice crisp and businesslike, my client has reviewed your initial proposal. While she appreciates the financial provisions for the child, she finds them insufficient in other areas. Robert's lawyer, a slick corporate litigator named Arthur, shifted in his seat. Insufficient? The trust is ironclad. The child will be set for life. Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice calm and steady. My child already is set for life, Arthur. It will have a mother who loves it unconditionally. What is in question is whether it will have a father. The words hung in the air. Robert felt his cheeks burn with shame. Rachel is proposing a detailed co-parenting agreement, Margaret continued, sliding a thick document across the polished table. It outlines visitation schedules, holiday arrangements, and decisions regarding education and healthcare. It also includes several stipulations. Arthur picked up the document and began to read, his eyebrows rising higher with every page. Mandatory therapy sessions for Mr. Vance to continue for a minimum of 2 years. Completion of 3 separate parenting courses. A probationary period of supervised visitation for the first 6 months. This is unorthodox. This is non-negotiable, Rachel said firmly. Robert didn't even look at the document. He looked at Rachel. I'll do it, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Arthur turned to him, astonished. Robert, let's discuss this. Some of these clauses could be seen as punitive. They're not punitive, Arthur. They're prudent, Robert said, never taking his eyes off Rachel. She's right. I haven't earned the right to be called a father yet. I need to show that I can be one. He turned his full attention to his estranged wife. I'll sign it. I'll do all of it, Rachel, and more. Whatever it takes. For the first time, a flicker of surprise registered in her eyes. She had expected a fight, a negotiation, another example of him trying to leverage his power. She had not expected this quiet, immediate capitulation. The agreement also states, Margaret added, pressing on, that you are not to have overnight contact with Isabel Morrow or any other romantic partner during your parenting time for the first 5 years. This was the final test, a direct shot at the source of the betrayal. Isabel and I are no longer associated, personally or professionally, Robert stated, his voice even. She resigned from the company 2 months ago. That clause will not be an issue. The room fell silent. Rachel stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time since that horrible night. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also a glimmer of something she hadn't seen in years. Sincerity. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to manipulate the situation. He was simply agreeing. Very well, Margaret said, closing her folder. We'll have the final documents drawn up for your signature. As they all stood to leave, Robert spoke again. Rachel, wait. She paused at the door, her back to him. The nursery, he said, his voice catching slightly. I had it finished, the way you wanted, with the mural of the stars on the ceiling you showed me a picture of. If you ever need anything from the apartment, or if you just want to see it, it's there. For the baby. She didn't turn around, but she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Then she walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, having just signed away his power and taken the first, terrifying step toward earning back his humanity. 5 months later, in the dead of a cold January night, Robert's phone rang. He had been dozing in a chair in his silent, cavernous living room, a book about infant sleep patterns lying open on his chest. He grabbed the phone, his heart instantly hammering. The caller ID read, Clara. Robert, it's time. Clara's voice was tense but steady. Her water broke an hour ago. We're at Lenox Hill. I'm on my way, he said, already on his feet, pulling on the shoes he'd left by the door for this exact moment. He had a bag packed in his car, not for him, but for Rachel, filled with the snacks, comfortable socks and coconut water her birth plan had specified. He had memorized the entire document. This was the moment his therapy and parenting classes had been leading up to. His therapist's voice echoed in his head. Your role is not to demand, but to support. You are not the protagonist of this story, Robert. You are a supporting actor. Show up, be quiet, and do whatever she asks of you. He broke every speed limit getting to the hospital, his mind a silent prayer. Let her be okay. Let the baby be okay. He found Clara in the waiting room of the maternity ward, pacing a hole in the linoleum floor. How is she? He asked, breathless. She's a warrior, Clara said, her eyes red-rimmed. The contractions are getting intense. She's in the room at the end of the hall, room 612. Did she ask for me? Robert asked, his hope fragile. Clara gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and exasperation. No, Robert. She's a little busy right now, but she didn't say you couldn't be here. That's your olive branch. Don't mess it up. He nodded, understanding. He walked to the end of the hall and stood outside room 612. Through the small window in the door, he could see Rachel. Her face was contorted in pain, her hands gripping the bed rails. A nurse was coaching her through a contraction. His first instinct was to burst in, to hold her hand, to tell her she could do it, but he stopped himself. That was what the old Robert would have done. Made the moment about him, about his need to be the hero. The new Robert understood. This was her space, her battle. He was here to offer support, not to invade. So he waited. He sat on the hard plastic chair outside her door and waited. For hours. He listened to her pained cries and the calm, encouraging murmurs of the nurses and Clara. He fielded calls from his office, telling his assistant to cancel his entire week. "It's a family emergency," he said, and for the first time the words felt true. His family was in that room, and his empire could burn to the ground for all he cared. A nurse on her break saw him sitting there, his expensive suit rumpled, his face etched with worry. "You the father?" she asked kindly. "I'm trying to be," he answered honestly. "She's strong," the nurse said with a smile. "You've got a fighter in there." After what felt like a lifetime, a new sound cut through the air. Not a cry of pain, but a cry of life. The thin, mighty wail of a newborn baby. Tears streamed down Robert's face. He buried his head in his hands, overcome with a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled him. Relief, joy, and a profound, bottomless love for a person he hadn't even met yet. He stayed where he was, giving them their time. 10 minutes later, the door opened. It was Clara, her face beaming and tear-streaked. "It's a girl, Robert," she whispered. "She's perfect. Rachel's asking for you." He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked into the room. The scent of new life was in the air. Rachel was propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, looking more beautiful and exhausted than he had ever seen her. And in her arms, wrapped in a pink and white striped blanket, was a tiny, perfect baby with a tuft of dark hair. He approached the bed slowly, reverently. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man, humbled and broken and remade, standing in the presence of a miracle he had almost thrown away. The hospital room felt like a sacred space. The chaotic energy of labor had been replaced by a deep, peaceful quiet, punctuated only by the soft, snuffly sounds of the baby. Robert stood by the bed, his hands clasped behind his back, feeling like an intruder on a holy scene. Rachel looked up at him, her eyes weary but clear. The anger and resentment that had been a wall between them for so long seemed to have dissolved, washed away by the tidal wave of childbirth. In its place was a shared vulnerability. "She's beautiful, Lena," he whispered, his voice thick. "She looks like you," Rachel said softly, a faint smile touching her lips as she looked down at the baby's face. Poor thing. It was a joke, a tiny sliver of their old rapport, and it felt like a gift, a small measure of grace. Do you want to hold her?" Rachel asked, her voice gentle. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He just nodded, unable to speak. He washed his hands at the sink, the motions slow and deliberate, then sat on the edge of the chair beside her bed. Rachel carefully, expertly, transferred the warm, precious bundle into his arms. The baby was so light, so impossibly small. She squirmed and made a little noise, her tiny, wrinkled face bunching up. Her eyes were closed, her eyelashes fine as silk. Robert stared at her, completely mesmerized. This was his daughter, a real, living, breathing piece of his heart, now existing outside of his body. He felt the weight of his failures, the selfishness of his ambition, the cruelty of his betrayal, all crashing down on him. But as he looked at this perfect, innocent life, he also felt a powerful, cleansing wave of purpose. This was his chance to atone, not with words or money, but with a lifetime of devotion. Have you thought of a name?" he asked, his gaze never leaving his daughter's face. "I was thinking, Lily," Rachel said, "for new beginnings, for purity." "Lily," Robert repeated. "Lily Vance. It's perfect." He looked up at Rachel, his eyes swimming with tears. "Thank you, Rachel, for this gift. For not shutting me out completely." "She deserves a father," Rachel said, her voice tired but firm. "Whether you deserve to be one is up to you to prove from this moment on." There was no magical forgiveness in her words, no promise of a reconciled future. It was a statement of fact, a challenge, and it was a challenge he was ready to spend the rest of his life meeting. He spent the next hour just holding Lily, studying every detail of her face, letting her tiny fingers curl around his thumb. He and Rachel didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They were no longer husband and wife, but they were now linked in the most profound way possible. They were parents, co-creators of this new life. When a nurse came in to check on Rachel, Robert carefully handed Lily back to her mother. As he stood up to leave, to give them space, he paused. "I meant what I said, Lena," he said quietly, "about doing whatever it takes. I know I broke our life, but I will not fail this one. I will not fail her." Rachel simply nodded, her eyes on the beautiful baby in her arms. He walked out of the hospital into the crisp, pre-dawn air. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the city in shades of soft pink and grey. The world felt new. The old Robert Kemp had died in that silent, lonely penthouse. The man who walked out of the hospital was someone different. He was Lily's father, and that was a title he was determined to earn. 2 years passed. Life did not snap back into a fairy tale. There was no grand romantic reunion. Instead, something quieter, more realistic, and ultimately more profound took root. A partnership. Robert kept his word. He was a constant, steady presence in Lily's life. He finished his parenting courses. He never missed a therapy session. He adhered to every clause of their co-parenting agreement with a devotion that surprised even his own lawyer. He learned to be a father not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday moments. He mastered the art of the diaper change, learned to distinguish the hungry cry from the tired cry, and could recite every word to Lily's favorite bedtime story, Good Night Moon. He downsized his life, selling the cold, cavernous penthouse and moving into a more modest, though still luxurious, brownstone in the West Village. It had a small backyard, which he filled with a swing set and a sandbox. He restructured his company, delegating more, traveling less, and making it a non-negotiable rule that he was unreachable between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. every night, Lily's bath time and bedtime. Rachel, free from the constraints of her old life, flourished. She had moved into her own apartment in Brooklyn, a sunny space with a large studio room. Her art, born from pain, had evolved. It became bolder, more vibrant. Her collection, which she titled The Storm and the Calm, was featured in Clara's gallery. It was a critical and commercial success. She was no longer Rachel Vance, the millionaire's wife. She was Rachel Hayes, an artist whose work spoke of resilience and rebirth. They co-parented with a quiet respect and efficiency that sometimes felt more like a business arrangement. But it was one built on a foundation of trust that Robert was painstakingly rebuilding. Their handoffs in a park halfway between their homes were polite, focused on Lily's schedule, her latest word, or a funny face she had learned to make. One bright, crisp Saturday afternoon in autumn, they met at that park. Lily, now a bubbly toddler with her father's intense eyes and her mother's warm smile, was taking her first truly confident steps. She toddled on unsteady legs across the grass, a look of fierce concentration on her face. Robert and Rachel sat on a bench, a comfortable distance between them, watching her. "Her daycare teacher says she's the most determined child in the class," Rachel said, a proud smile on her face. "When she wants something, she doesn't give up." "She gets that from her mother," Robert said, his gaze soft as he watched his daughter. He meant it. He had once mistaken Rachel's kindness for weakness. He now knew it was the bedrock of a strength he could only dream of possessing. Rachel looked at him, a genuine, unguarded warmth in her eyes. "She gets it from both of us." It was a small acknowledgement, but it felt monumental. A recognition that they were a team, that Lily was a perfect fusion of their best parts. Lily, having successfully navigated a treacherous patch of grass, stopped and looked back. She saw both her parents watching her. She grinned, a wide, toothy grin, and then, for the first time, she walked a straight line, right from the spot where she stood, across the space that separated them. She walked away from her mother and straight into the waiting, open arms of her father. Robert lifted her up, burying his face in her soft curls, his heart swelling with a love so pure and powerful it almost hurt. He looked over at Rachel, who was watching them, her face illuminated by the afternoon sun. Their old love story was over. The book closed forever. But as they sat there, two separate people bound by a shared love for their child, it felt like they were just beginning to write a new one. It wasn't a story of romance, but one of redemption, respect, and the quiet, enduring grace of a second chance. The canvas of their future was different than they had ever imagined, but it was, in its own way, beautiful. Robert and Rachel's journey shows us that sometimes the greatest tragedies can lead to the most profound transformations. Their story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to change, and that true strength isn't about never falling, but about how we choose to get back up and rebuild. What did you think of Rachel's decision to leave and build her own life? Could you forgive Robert? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories that explore the depths of the human heart.